that he went on foot to Baltimore, which made me think and almost make sure that Henry went to see his family. How would Henry have known that his family would have come from Baltimore? It probably, most certainly, is because Henry was informed about his inheritance from his father, Henry Anderson O'Donnell. He died in 1840. The will was executed in 1841. It took a couple of years for that will to get to the United States. Probably the Irish family of the O'Donnells made contact with a son of John O'Donnell the merchant named Columbus. Probably asked Columbus to track down Henry so they could give him his inheritance. Columbus probably did find Henry. I keep saying probably because all this I cannot sustain with any documents. There is no documentation. But it is very probable that that's what happened. That is the reason why Henry probably went to Baltimore on foot. It was not for sightseeing, it was not a touristic trip. He had a very specific reason to go to walk to Baltimore. In Baltimore he probably met Columbus, where Columbus told him that he inherited 500 pounds sterling from his father Henry Anderson O'Donnell. Columbus himself, at the time that Henry Anderson O'Donnell, his uncle, died, was not old. When Columbus's father, John O'Donnell the merchant, died, which was Henry's uncle, Columbus was still very young. Columbus did not know a lot about Henry either. Even if Henry would have asked Columbus, I am here, what's the story? I hear I inherited 500 pounds sterling. He probably asked Columbus, where is that coming from? What could Columbus say? I don't really know. But this is the will, apparently, of your father, Henry Anderson O'Donnell. And that's basically all I know. So Henry didn't know much either. And I know that, especially in the William branch of the O'Donnell family, your branch, there was a story passed on that Henry and Columbus were brothers. And I think that this misconception came into existence when Henry met Columbus. There might have been talk about, since Columbus didn't know a lot and Henry didn't know a lot about each other's history, especially not about their respective father's history, that there might have been something said that we are like brothers, or your father and my father are brothers. Those words could have easily been twisted through the generations and ended up nowadays with a misconception that Henry and Columbus were brothers. The interesting story about that is that in previous generations, in another line of Henry's family, the line through Daniel, Henry's son, that there were attempts made to make claim on Columbus's inheritance. Columbus became a very rich businessman in Baltimore. As many of you know, he owned the gas company, he owned the water company, he owned half Baltimore, he owned a lot of stocks in the railroad. He died a rich businessman. When Columbus died, he left a big inheritance. Columbus wrote a very detailed will where everything was bequeathed to the last cent. Columbus wanted to make sure that everything of his inheritance was covered. Henry is not mentioned in that will. That will is about somewhere around 40 to 50 pages long. I read the whole will. There is no Henry O'Donnell in there. Columbus's kids are in there. Columbus's grandkids are in there. But not his assumed brother, because Henry was not his brother. They were mere cousins. Now, in the second generation after Henry, the misconception existed that Henry and Columbus were brothers, for understandable reasons. And it was Daniel's granddaughter, Ida, who went to visit her brother, who lived in the mountains in the west. I don't know who this mysterious brother is yet, but this brother received a letter 20 years prior to when Ida visited this brother, where somebody was inquiring about Henry and Columbus's inheritance. The brother kept the letter for 20 years but never thought much of it. Ida went to visit him 20 years later and got knowledge of that letter. Ida, together with the misconception that her grandfather Henry and Columbus were brothers, she went from her homestead in Nebraska, together with her mother, Daniel's widow, Nancy Raymond. She went to Baltimore, which was quite a trip. I'm talking about 1917 here, which was quite a trip at the time. Interesting thing is that she met with Alexander, a son of Henry O'Donnell. And Alexander, together with his son, Daniel Smith O'Donnell, they all went to Baltimore. And they hired a lawyer, an attorney, Mr. Gerhardt, in Baltimore, to make claim on Columbus's inheritance. To no avail. There are no court records whatsoever. There is not a single lawyer that deposited a case at any court in Baltimore or surroundings pertaining to Columbus's inheritance. Probably because the lawyer did some investigation, found John the Merchant's will, probably also found in John the Merchant's paperwork Henry Anderson O'Donnell's will, and came to the conclusion that Henry, however related, being a cousin, was not a rightful heir to the O'Donnell estates. Therefore, the case was never deposited at any court. Interesting detail is that on their way back, Ida and her mother Nancy Jane went to visit Priscilla Bennett. Priscilla Bennett is no other than a daughter of Henry. And I just wonder what the subject of conversation was. And they probably made report of their trip to Baltimore. It was not followed up, probably because the attorney found out there are no rights here. Even if Henry was, in a hypothetical case, if Henry was a brother to Columbus, he still would not have had any right on Columbus's inheritance, because the kids come first. And Columbus, as far as I know, had like 6 or 8 kids himself. They were the first rightful heirs. So Henry would have not had any right anyway. That was in 1917. 3 years later, in 1920, another daughter of Daniel, a granddaughter of Henry, in 1920, Margaret, at that time married to a Mr. Wilson, Margaret Wilson inquired with the National Archives in Washington about Henry O'Donnell's military records in order to find who Henry's parents were, so she could make claim on the O'Donnell estate. So Ida's sister, Margaret, did another attempt to make claim, to no avail, because parents are usually not mentioned in military records. The answer from Washington was therefore too, we have the military records of Henry, parents are not mentioned. And that was the end of it. And as far as I know, that was the last official attempt that anybody made to claim anything of Columbus's inheritance. Now, the interesting thing is that we have John the Merchant, and I'm not going to tell his story because we're going to be here till next week. It's a story that is like a movie of Indiana Jones. John the Merchant and Henry Anderson, his brother, they came from County Clare, Ireland. They came from not a royal, but a rich O'Donnell family that actually did own a castle, Castle Trough. And they owned estates in Ireland.
He knew George Washington. Did you know that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you know that too?
Yeah.
Okay. That's really interesting to me. I didn't know if you knew that.
The interesting thing is that we have, as I call it, a rich O'Donnell branch who descend from County Clare, Ireland, who is related, that family is related to all you O'Donnells, to all of you. You're all blood related to the rich O'Donnells. The interesting thing is that, as I call it, with all respect guys, with all respect, as I call it, the poor O'Donnells, and we have the rich O'Donnells.
The Black Irish. We're the black.
And they
the black.
Both branches of the family lived together. They built their generations together in this country, even very close to each other, parallel to each other, without even knowing of each other. And that's all because Henry, being a natural but illegitimate child, was kept under the blanket by the O'Donnell family. And that's probably why that is. You guys want to meet